The year is 1981. Yacht design was changing. Most of the boats that you saw were sort of production boats, conventional. IOR came along, the rating rule, and it was in the 70s when it really kind of started. In fact, the most famous boat, IOR-wise, you could arguably say was Gambare here in San Diego, owned by Doug Peterson, set the world on fire and changed the whole face of yacht design in terms of IR boats and in terms of the way they looked and the way they performed. And no, I'm not talking this boat here. I'm talking this boat right here. This is a Schumacher 30.
1, 2, 3, listen.
Here I am on board the Schumacher 30. Carl Schumacher is the designer. Most of you know who he is. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2002, but his body of work, it was impressive, no doubt, from top performing boats like Swiftsure, Summertime Dream, there's all kind, National Biscuit. Carl Schumacher drew a lot of boats. Lived in Northern California. Most of the custom boats that he did were for up there, but he did a lot of production boats. I mean, a ton of them. The Capo line, the Aileron line, he's done most of those boats. And this boat is a bit of an anomaly, and one reason why we wanted to share it with you today is because there just ain't many of them. This boat was built by Dennis Choate, and anybody who's been around at all has probably been on a Choate float. World famous surfboard designer, really great builder. He was a guy who turned out a boat for not a lot of buck and a fair bit of bang. His boats have stood the test of time, and this is a really interesting one. So the Schumacher 30, they only built 5 of them. It's not to be confused with the Choate 30, which was a variation on this a little bit, but still from Dennis Choate, designed by Carl Schumacher, and here you have it, a nice looking boat. This particular boat has been totally redone and in a really beautiful way, well, with a couple of exceptions, and I'll show you those quickly. In fact, let's hop back to the cockpit. Let's start right back there. Let's go. So this boat is a vintage boat, of course, and a couple of the design characteristics are that it's relatively beamy. It's got some tumble home, and we'll show you how much this boat has a little bit later. It's relatively narrow-ish in the back, but certainly not a real pinch transom like sort of the late 70s IOR boats had. This boat's a little wider back here, but it has one thing everybody universally hates, and I'm hanging on to it right now. It's called runners. Okay, this boat's got upper and lower runners. You could call them checks as well. Because it's a fractional rig boat, it has masthead spinnakers on it, which is great. It also has a small prod in the front, and we'll look at that a little bit later. But you just have to have runners on a fractional rig. I mean, it's the only way to support the mast. It's got, of course, a permanent backstay, which I'll bet they don't use very much. And runners are just a fact of when you have an inline mast, that is, the shrouds are in line with the mast. They're not aft of the mast, which is what you do for a fractional rig, and you don't want runners, right? Bring the chain plates aft, sweep the spreaders aft, and those, in effect, do the work of what runners do. It's really slick. Back in 1981, no, they didn't have it. Okay, couple things about this boat that's just kind of weird, but I don't want to rag on it too much. I mean, you know, I love to rag on boats, but this is just what it was back then. So for the helmsman's position, let's just see right here. So he sits right here. He put on these nice little footrests. The hiking stick would come out right here, and he sits here. Now, typically on a boat like this, the helmsman does his own main a lot of times. So the main sheet's right here, and he's got a fine tune and a coarse tune, and so he can do his own main here, or he can have a mainsail trimmer, I guess Buddy right up next to him, or possibly right here. The runners come here and they go to the winch if you really have to crank them on, and the check stays, as you can see, have their own separate adjustment, just depending on how much mast bend you have, how much mast bend you want, and how much mast bend you don't want. That's what you'll control all that with. Okay, so this is fine, fairly isolated back here, but here's where it gets weird. So I'm at this level here, right? Yeah, okay. But then when I step here, I just got a hell of a lot shorter. And that's because the cockpit drops down, looks like to be about 8 or 10 inches. Now, I partly understand it because I guess it gives you a little better access to here as opposed to standing up here and trying to trim, but down here at least you can get a little bit more into it. But it's a narrow cockpit. I mean, it's got wide side decks. A modern boat would no way have that. In fact, a modern boat, you'd probably cut right here and just come all the way back, and then you'd widen the cockpit. What's that? I don't know, 4 feet? That makes a huge difference here. But, you know, this is kind of how they did it. So once you're in the pit here, you know, it's difficult to get out of here. You got to climb out, and if it's heeling and all those scary things, it's just what this is. Going slightly forward, halyard winches are here. These also double as secondary winches for spinnaker sheets. So you can either go to here or you can go to here. Here's all your jams. And I mean, the problem with these is they're up here. And if I want to go a little closer, I have to go down here. And then that's probably a little more difficult. Again, a lot of this is just the ergonomics of how boats were. They didn't really have all this stuff totally figured out, but for the time, it was great. So yeah, if you're the pit person, everything is right here, including the boom bang adjustment. You see these little tracks here? So these are probably one of 3 things. They're either, you could use them as check stays, but I don't think so because it already has the lower checks attached to the uppers. This is probably for the number 3 Genoa. I would guess it probably sheets somewhere in here. If you sheet too far outboard with a small LP jib, you just won't get a proper sheeting angle. So they probably put the number 3 jib here. In San Diego, we don't have a lot of number 3 conditions, so these things probably hardly ever get used. And this sort of shows you essentially what the cockpit is. I mean, a 30-foot boat, you're not going to have a lot more than this. This boat has a nice cabin house on it. It's a proper height, it's good looking, and it's wide. And so why? Why all the width? Because when you go down below, you got more volume down there. And this boat is actually fairly spacious down below, and we'll spend a little time down there as well. So this is it. It's all right before you. Nothing mysterious. You don't ever go, hey, where's the? Because it's right here in front of you. And that's how Carl Schumacher drew the boat. That's how Dennis Choate built it. I like it. Unique to San Diego and a few other parts of the country and likely the world is the thing called kelp. And it is a giant pain in the ass to race in a kelp infested bay or ocean. Sometimes it's absolutely amazingly unbearable. We talked in some of our earlier videos about the need for having a kelp knife, kelp cutter, that'll cut kelp off the leading edge of a relatively vertical keel. This boat has some sweep to the leading edge of the keel, so I doubt the keel catches it, but it might. But one place for sure where it catches it is on the rudder. And here comes this handy dandy little device. We found this in the bow. I knew exactly what it was because I have one too. So this is a kelp pole, and this is used to get kelp off the rudder. It's one of the most awful jobs on a boat. If you have an outboard rudder like the Flying Tiger, easy, just reach back there and you can mostly pull it off. This boat, like all other boats, has the rudder somewhat inboard. So how are you gonna get to that thing? I'll give you a rough demonstration. So what you have to do is get back here. You probably have to have somebody hold your legs. And then what you wanna do is force this thing down fast enough to get on the leading edge of the rudder. Force it down as far as you can get it and see if you can get it to swipe off the leading edge of the keel and that, or the leading edge of the rudder, excuse me, and that should get the kelp off. But as we all know, having done this numerous times, rarely do you get it off on one swipe. So it's usually honestly about a 5-minute process depending upon how much kelp you have, how far down the rudder it is. You got to have one of these. Otherwise, you'll just never get it off properly. These things are not that cheap. You know, they're carbon fiber. They're custom for each boat. But if you're racing in San Diego or anywhere where there's kelp and it hangs up on your rudder, and it does, you need one of these. So I mentioned tumble home a little bit earlier, and most of you know what it is, but tumble home is essentially a bulge, if you will, a bit of a roundness to the hole right up here. For IOR, a lot of boats had tumble home because it fooled the rule. The whole idea in IOR was to do something that the rule didn't expect. So if you put a little more tumble home in the boat, you measured the boat and the actual beam came out different than what the real beam was because you had tumble home. So that was max beam and it's actually a little wider. The boat's actually not that narrow, but because of the tumble home, it makes you think that it's wider. You can just compare it to a boat right here next to us. This is an SA850, slab-sided, because there's no reason to have this. This is just on a boat that you're just designing a nice boat, right? The SA is a super clean, slick, simple, modern sport boat. Back in the day, 1981, they did boats different. They were designed different for a different purpose. So you wouldn't do this today. And this for tumble home is relatively moderate, but it gives you a good example of what it looks like and kind of what it was for. Okay, this boat carries both symmetrical spinnakers and it carries asymmetrical spinnakers. It's kind of the modern development in boats that really were only designed for symmetrical spinnakers. What a lot of people do, and this guy did quite nicely, is they had a prod put on the front of the boat, a sprit that sticks out, well, I don't know, maybe a little over 2 feet in front of the boat. It's really the only way to do it, because if you're going to jibe an asymmetrical spinnaker, you need to have it out in front of the boat so when it jibes, it clears everything through, being the bow pulpit and everything else. If you don't, and you just have it tacking off the front, it's really hard that when you go to jibe to not have the spinnaker, the tack of the spinnaker get hung up through here. So you put a prod on the boat, you put a tack line through this on-tall ring, and it runs aft. And so he's got the option to do both, depending upon what the point of sail is going to be. He can fly the symmetricals if he's running, and if it's going to be more reachy, he's got asymmetricals. You also got a code 0 on this boat, which is probably a very useful weapon. Be nice if we could put it up here, but you know, we'll just wrap it and it'll catch on another boat's spreaders and rip, and then we'll say, well, we didn't do it. We had nothing to do with it. So they modernized the boat and made it so that it's just got more range, more capabilities. Again, as I said, masthead spinnakers, which are just required in San Diego on a fractional rig boat. It's clean, it's nice, and the boat actually goes fairly well. So that's on deck. Let's head below. Down below, the Schumacher 30. Pretty voluminous, right? Remember the Express 37 that we did, also designed by Carl Schumacher? Voluminous. That boat had relatively similar proportions. Fair bit of beam, some freeboard on the boat, and then you get this kind of room. A couple of nice settees here, and you can see, just like on deck, the owner of this boat has really made this thing nice with the red cushions, really kind of nice looking faux teak on the floorboards. That's a nice touch. Keel step mast, they add the support in here for the boat just because, well, just because. Boat's got an enclosed head, if you can believe it or not. It's got an actual hanging locker, wow, and then it's all empty up there for sails. You know, predominantly a race boat, right? And so the idea, keep weight out of that end at least. I don't know that they did a great job keeping the weight out of that end, and I'll show you exactly what I mean. But you know, nice enough thing down here. You probably wouldn't suspect that this boat would have, you know, nice varnished bulkheads and good fit and finish. For a 1981 boat, it's pretty stellar. Here I am in the galley of the Schumacher 30. Nice, right? Icebox here, doubles as a nav station. Sink, stove. Oh wait, there isn't a stove, but there sure is a nice assortment of blocks here. See what I can, they won't notice if these are gone. Take a winch handle. No, I won't. But I think a stove's supposed to be there, but he did make a custom drink holder here. And one nice thing, I'm sure this is for us, of course, the ubiquitous red cocktail and the Sailor Jerry rum in plastic. So every boat's got to have that. Here's something that you wouldn't find on most boats. So I'm going to lean into the nav station here. Anyway, he's got a Sharpie. I mean, that's cool. He's got another Sharpie. 3 Sharpies. It's got another Sharpie. That's another one. That's another one. There's like 5 more. Like, what the hell? Like, Like signing autographs? I mean, I carry 2 or 3 because, you know, I get stopped for autographs all the time. I can't explain this. But one thing I can explain. So, you know how we talked about the decks are nice and wide, and it's kind of weird that the cockpit's so narrow, and here's why. If you open this up, if you make that wide, you cut that out of there, well, guess what? You're gonna lose all this space. If you widen this cockpit out, you're gonna lose this. So, in the quest to try to get enough bunks down below a 30-footer, so there's 2 in the settees, 2 in the corner, I guess you can probably sleep 2 in each one, depending. There's only one way to do that, and you got to make a cutout big enough to get back there. And so, hence the cockpit is narrow and deep. You wouldn't do that on a today boat, not at all, but that's what it is. And so when I talked a little bit about the weight being aft, so because the Galley's aft, so you've got all this built-in wood with the icebox, and then you've got all this furniture as well, and then you've got the inboard. I think it's got a Yanmar diesel right here. So, you know, you're carrying some weight aft in this boat, and I think in SoCal, you'd like to have a lot of this further forward, but that's just the way the boats were, and it seems to work pretty darn nicely. And this is down below the Schumacher 30 with Sharpies. We hope you enjoyed this version of Retro Boat, the Schumacher 30. Cool, right? Good looking. This boat's nicely redone. It's got some modern features, the sprit, the masthead kites, the kelp pole. Boat rate's 135 in PHRF. So I'm pretty sure we're gonna be in this boat's class on my Ericsson 35 Mark II Anarchy 5. I wouldn't bet on us. I'd bet on this one. If you like this video, there's a like button down there. There's a subscribe button to our channel, which you should absolutely do. For Nobleman Productions, for Sailing Anarchy, I'm Scot Tempesta. We're out.
It kinda makes you feel